On a humid August night in 1791, drums and a single prayer in the hills of northern Saint-Domingue lit a fuse beneath a world built on sugar and chains. That ceremony, and the violence that followed, helped splinter empires and force a rethinking of what freedom could mean. But why did the same Atlantic upheaval create Haiti, a black republic, yet lead to very different outcomes across Spanish America and Brazil? The late 18th century Atlantic world looked stable to the men in powdered wigs and in Creole salons, but it was actually a pressure cooker of salt, sugar, and law. On one side were the metropolitan empires, Spain, Portugal, and France, arranged by legal status. Peninsulares, those born in Europe, monopolized the highest offices. Below them were the Creoles, people of European descent born in the Americas, often wealthy hacienda owners who wanted the prestige and titles they were denied. Beyond the plantations lived millions of indigenous people in the Andes and vast numbers of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and the Brazilian backlands. Saint-Domingue, the French colony on Hispaniola, was the richest sugar factory in the world, a place where wealth and violence were inseparable. Cap Francais smelled of boiling cane, of rum, and of the constant hum of labor. There were also free people of color, often prosperous, who chafed against legal discrimination. Ideas from Paris and London circulated in this humid air: Enlightenment pamphlets, Rousseau and Montesquieu, the news of 1789, and then the convulsions of the French Revolution. Those ideas arrived with terrifying promise and thrilling possibility. When Napoleon moved on the Iberian crowns in 1808, forcing the abdication of Ferdinand VII, it shattered the axis of imperial authority. Colonial bureaucracies faltered, and Creole elites in Caracas, Buenos Aires, Quito, and Mexico City debated juntas, loyalty, and the shape of self-rule. In Portugal, the royal family sailed to shore in Rio de Janeiro in 1808, moving the court and elevating Brazil from colony to imperial partner. Before any shots were fired, questions hung in the air. Who would claim sovereignty when empires faltered?
What would freedom mean in societies built on bondage? Who would get the land, the guns, and the courts? These were not abstractions. They smelled like wood smoke in the Andes, tasted like boiled cane juice in Cap Francais, and echoed in the bells of the parish of Dolores in central Mexico, waiting to be rung.
By the humid hills where I began, the first explosive moment was not a salon debate, but a midnight ceremony at Bois Cayman in August 1791. Accounts vary, but the scene is vivid. Bookmen and other leaders of enslaved communities gathered by firelight, drums beating, vows sworn. That night, the sugar estate at Dondon and dozens more went up in flames. Planters woke to smoke, blazing sugar works, and columns of runaways moving through the cane. This was not a polite petition. It was an unsettlement of the deepest order. Within months, the revolt had metastasized into a coordinated war. Free people of color like Vincent Ogé had already pressed legal claims in the 1790s and been crushed, but the 1791 uprising drew in large armies of the enslaved. Out of that chaos, Toussaint Louverture emerged as a figure of iron will. He had been a literate coachman and later a plantation overseer who rose to become a military commander. His strategy combined disciplined formations, scorched earth attacks on plantation infrastructure, and clever diplomacy that shifted alliances between the Spanish, the British, and after 1794, the French Republic, which had abolished slavery. While Saint-Domingue convulsed, the Iberian crisis set off a different chain of events in 1808. In Mexico, on September 16, 1810, the parish priest Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla rang the bell at Dolores and tore through the ritual restraint of the morning. He called for an end to peninsular dominance and for popular justice, and his cry brought peasants and indigenous villagers into open war. A similar pattern played out in Caracas and Buenos Aires, where Creole elites debated juntas. When they took up arms, it was often to claim political legitimacy rather than to overturn property relations. Planters in Cap Francais and Léogane fled to forts, British ships hovered offshore, and letters from Paris arrived in fits and starts. Creole elites in Lima and Santiago watched with a mix of alarm and calculation. Some began to arm militias, others sought compromise through provincial juntas. The continent was being remade, and these first ruptures were raw, public, and irreversible. The situation grew more complicated when Napoleon insisted the Atlantic colonies must submit again to the mother country. In 1802, he sent General Charles Leclerc with a large expedition to Saint-Domingue to reimpose control. French ships landed at Cap Français and on the plains of the Artibonite, and the campaign quickly turned brutal. But European rifles could not overcome tropical disease and a determined insurgency. Toussaint Louverture was lured into negotiations, arrested in 1802, sent to Fort de Joux in France, and died in captivity in 1803. The French force itself was devastated by yellow fever and attrition. Command passed to Jean-Jacques Dessalines and other former slaves, who intensified guerrilla warfare, targeted plantation infrastructure, and in January 1st, 1804, proclaimed Haiti independent. The proclamation was extraordinary. A slave army had founded the first independent black republic in the Atlantic, and slavery had been abolished by force. Across the Spanish Main, the story was different but no less violent. Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin built disciplined, liberating armies that blended formal battles with guerrilla raids. Bolivar's victory at Boyaca on August 7, 1819, opened New Granada. Antonio José de Sucre's campaigns and the decisive victory at Ayacucho on December 9, 1824, finally ended Spain's military presence in South America. San Martin crossed the Andes in 1817 to liberate Chile and then moved on to Peru. In Mexico, a negotiated settlement between insurgent Vicente Guerrero and the conservative Agustín de Iturbide produced the Plan of Iguala and independence in 1821. Portugal's royal transplant to Rio de Janeiro in 1808 altered Brazil's destiny. By living among Brazilian elites, the Portuguese court raised local status, and when Prince Pedro refused to return to Lisbon, he declared independence on September 7, 1822, creating an empire that preserved existing property relations and slavery. Those years were also dense with foreign influence and pressure. British diplomats and merchants sought new markets. The United States watched from the perspective of the Monroe Doctrine, and Haiti both inspired liberation movements and unsettled slave-holding societies. Leaders were no longer only theorists. They were generals, governors, and exiles who had to convert revolutionary energy into institutions or armies. Notably, Alexandre Pétion of Haiti offered Simon Bolivar sanctuary and material support from 1815, insisting that emancipation be part of liberation. Later, Britain recognized many new Spanish-American states in the 1820s to open trade, and France demanded reparations from Haiti that would haunt its economy for decades. The final pressure point came when decisions about who would own the land had to be written into law. In Haiti, the choice was immediate and existential. After the expulsion of the French and the Declaration of Independence, Jean-Jacques Dessalines proclaimed himself emperor in October 1804 and ordered a brutal purge of remaining French residents. He was assassinated in 1806, and the republic that followed quickly split. The north became a kingdom under Henri Christophe, and the south a republic under Alexandre Pétion. Christophe built the fortress of Sans Souci and crowned himself King Henry I, maintaining a militarized plantation labor system in the north. Pétion, by contrast, redistributed land to veterans and supported insurgent movements in South America. On the mainland, new states struck very different bargains. Mexico's Plan of Iguala in 1821 guaranteed the Catholic religion, protected property rights, and preserved the privileges of conservative elites. That framework helped Agustín de Iturbide be proclaimed emperor, though he was ousted about a year later as the country settled into elite-dominated republican rule. Bolivar's project of a continental republicanism in Gran Colombia collapsed into rivalries by 1830, splitting into Venezuela, Ecuador, and New Granada. Brazil followed a different path. Independence under Dom Pedro in 1822 preserved the monarchy and slavery, allowing plantation owners to keep existing labor systems and turning the empire into an axis of conservative continuity rather than radical social change. External powers were pressing as well. Britain courted the newly independent states to open markets and pushed to suppress the slave trade. Spain and France negotiated limited exit terms. France only recognized Haiti in 1825 after extracting an indemnity that crippled its economy. The United States watched through the lens of the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, a rhetorical shield against European recolonization that nevertheless left questions of race and property to the new republics themselves. By this point, the central tension was clear. The wars of independence had shattered imperial control, but they had not produced a single continent-wide definition of liberty. Some polities abolished slavery outright. Others postponed emancipation or re-embedded slavery in new national forms. Military leaders became presidents, caudillos rose to power, and land concentrated in a few hands. The result was a kind of political freedom that coexisted with growing social and economic inequality. The decisive moment in this hemisphere of upheaval was not a single battle, but a string of verdicts by new states about who would be free and who would govern. Haiti answered first and most radically. In January 2004, Jean-Jacques Dessalines declared Haiti independent, abolished slavery, and set about building a polity in which former bondsmen were the sovereign majority. The immediate consequences were dramatic. White planters fled or were killed, much plantation infrastructure was destroyed, and Europe recoiled. France only recognized Haiti's independence in 1825 after demanding an indemnity that crippled the country's credit and diplomatic standing for generations. The United States withheld formal recognition until the Civil War era. On the mainland, the verdicts were slower and more uneven. Creole-led republics wrote constitutions and set up courts, but they largely protected property and social hierarchies when it suited them. Mexico abolished slavery in 1829 under Vicente Guerrero, but in many other states, slavery persisted or was transformed into a regulated institution for decades. Brazil's independence in 1822 preserved the monarchy and the plantation economy, postponing emancipation until the last quarter of the 19th century. The political fallout mattered. Haiti's emancipation produced a state often governed by military leaders and split between northern monarchic authority and southern republicanism. Spanish America produced fragile republics where caudillos and oligarchs filled gaps of authority, and Brazil became a conservative empire that managed change on elite terms. Those verdicts settled the legal question of sovereignty, but left the social question open and combustible, shaping the region for generations. The longer-term impact of these divergent revolutions is visible today in political maps and social inequalities. Haiti proved that enslaved people could win sovereignty and ended slavery outright, but the consequences were severe. Diplomatic isolation and the 1825 French indemnity crippled Haiti's economy and constrained its development for decades. In Spanish America, Creole elites forged republics that kept land concentrated, preserved church and military power, and often deferred full emancipation. Mexico formally outlawed slavery in 1829, though implementation varied and some regions delayed full freedom. Brazil preserved monarchical order and slavery until the late 19th century, abolishing slavery only in 1888. Those post-war bargains shaped law and governance for generations. Where emancipation came first, the state itself was transformed. Where political independence preceded social reform, elites wrote new constitutions to protect property and status. The result was a hemisphere sovereign on paper, but still deeply unequal in practice. The haunting truth is that the same storms in the Atlantic produced different answers to liberty. The prayer at Bois Cayman, the Bell of Dolores, and the cry on the Ipiranga all pushed empires aside, but each nation wrote its own rules about who counted as a citizen. That unfinished argument about freedom endures in land reform protests, racial justice movements, and the politics of inclusion we see today.